Hi, everybody. Welcome to Auburn, Alabama, where it's 75 degrees or so. A bit cloudy as I look out the window. My name is Ken W. I'm a professor of history at Auburn University, although I'm not in my office on campus right now. I'm here in my office at home, which is appropriate perhaps because this is actually the space where I wrote the book that I'll be talking about today, The Howling Storm, Weather, Climate, and the American Civil War, published by LSU Press this week, which is why I'm your speaker this week on the LSU Remote Author Series. Before I get started, there are lots of people I'd like to thank. LB Kovac is in mission control right now, facilitating this. I need to mention Mike Barish, my series editor, Rand Dotson, managing editor and fellow Virginia Tech Okie, Neil Novak, Kevin Brock, who was my copy editor, all sorts of people. And I want to thank some of you too, because a lot of you, if you're actually out there like you're supposed to be, helped me a lot with this book, reading chapters and the like. It was much appreciated. And finally, if my friend Chuck Akers is watching, Chuck, I'm sorry, I thought about having a theme song today, but I was afraid of violating copyright laws, so we'll just have to do with that. The idea today is that I'm going to talk to you for about 25 minutes or a half an hour, and then I will turn it over to you, and you can ask me questions through your Facebook comments, and I'll try to answer as many of those as I can in the time we have remaining. We're pretty strictly working on an hour, so we'll just keep that in mind. I'll try not to go too long, although I do tend to run off a bit when I get excited about a topic, and I'm certainly excited about this one. I'm going to go to a PowerPoint now for a few minutes. I'll give you a few seconds to get caught up on that. I am a college professor, so we do a lot with PowerPoint now. There you see the book, I hope, The Howling Storm. And I thought I would start talking about this project today by beginning at the end. I've been working on this book for over 10 years. And one of the last things I was able to do before I sent it off to the publisher was come up with a title. It seemed like every time I came up with a title, somebody else used it, and it ended up on somebody else's book. Around my house, we called it the Weather Book. And I had friends and students and at least one well-known Civil War blog full of people trying to help me find a title for this book. And I never could find anything that I thought was appropriate until one afternoon I was working my way through the manuscript. And I came across a quotation from the man you see on the right. That's Henry Kidd Douglas, Confederate soldier. He was an aide to Stonewall Jackson. And in his memoir, I Rode with Stonewall, he described the scene the night of the Battle of Malvern Hill in July 1862, the last battle in the 7 days campaign around Virginia. The months leading up to the 7 days had been incredibly rainy and muddy on the Virginia Peninsula. By and large, the weather for the 7 days battles was hot with frequent thunderstorms. But the night after Malvern Hill, torrential rain fell, soaking men on the battlefield, soaking the wounded, soaking the dead, and certainly affecting those who were trying to scramble their way through the darkness to find comrades and bring them to safety. And remembering that night, Henry Kidd Douglas wrote, "The howling of the storm, the cry of the wounded and groans of the dying, the glare of the torch upon the faces of the dead, or into the shining eyes of the speechless wounded, looking up in hope of relief, the ground slippery with a mixture of mud and blood, all in the dark, hopeless, starless night. Surely it was a gruesome picture of war at its most horrid shape." I think more than any other quotation in this book, that one sums up what my book, The Howling Storm, is about. That mixture of mud and blood, that mixture of battle and the elements. We know that Civil War soldiers died of battlefield wounds. We know that they died more often of disease, but sometimes I think we forget those who froze to death on picket, or drowned in flooded rivers, or were struck by lightning, or caught on fire when dry forests began to burn. We forget that the Civil War took place outside. Now, I know that sounds strange. And I remember the first time I ever told an audience that the Civil War was fought outside. I thought it was a joke. I waited for them to laugh, but they didn't. They took it seriously, and I think they were right to do so. Because I think it's very important for us to place the American Civil War back into the environment, back out into the elements, back out into the weather. If you'll permit me for a second, in the introduction to the book, I quote Henry Kidd Douglas, just as I just did, and I write the following. And I think it will explain, hopefully will explain, what I mean by this notion of taking the Civil War back outside. The American Civil War was fought outdoors, in slippery red mud, as well as blood, and sometimes in the Howling Storm. Yet for generations, too many of the war's students have behaved otherwise, judged from our air-conditioned offices, classrooms, or comfortable recliners. It has been far too easy to pretend that the playing field was always level and dry. Moving troops through deep mud, heavy snow, or extreme heat is difficult for modern armies, equipped with Humvees and helicopters. Yet students of the Civil War still too readily jump to tired conclusions that a mid-19th century general's inability to move an army 20 miles a day through muck and mire must have grown out of his ineptitude or petulance. This book is based on a counter premise that a full understanding of the war requires regrounding it in the physical environment in ways that the farm boys who donned blue or gray understood to the point of taking it for granted. It takes the Civil War back out into the weather and re-narrates its military history from Fort Sumter to the end by including summertime heat, winter cold, snow and ice, dust, rain, and the deep red mud that characterized the Southern climate, and especially the war's unusual weather. What I do in this book is ask you to think about a war that did not take place just between the blue and the gray, but instead the blue, the gray, and the weather. That's to say that I give weather agency in this narrative. That's not to say that weather has a brain or that it was doing things deliberately, but nonetheless, weather was an important actor in the American Civil War. And most of the time, it was an ally of the Union, although it could be a fickle ally. And there's certainly moments in the war when it went across the boundary and helped the Confederates. The blue, the gray, and the weather. It's been about 20 years since I first started thinking about the Civil War this way. That was when I was starting to write a book on the Civil War battlefield at Perryville, Kentucky, the largest battle in Kentucky history. The anniversary is coming up this week. I knew a little bit about Perryville, but as I delved into my research and started to put it together, I realized that there was an important new character in the story that I had neglected before. That weather, in this case, a devastating summer drought, was in many ways just as important as Braxton Bragg or Don Carlos Buell. The armies that fought at Perryville, you see them represented in this painting in front of you, had hiked up from Alabama or Tennessee in the middle of this devastating drought. They arrived at the battlefield dehydrated. They arrived at the battlefield sick because the only water they often had been able to find along the way was green, covered in scum, full of microbes. They were terribly sick. And the battle itself began as a fight over water on the morning of the 8th. Confederates held a spring. The Federals needed that spring, and this battle began. Perryville is all about weather. Now, this was a surprise to me. I never really had put weather and the Civil War together, although I guess I should have looking back. I grew up in Southwest Virginia. My grandparents owned a farm. I spent many a day up on the farm bringing cattle in before it snowed, or hauling hay before the rain fell on it and ruined it. One summer I came home from college and my grandfather actually persuaded me to plant an entire field of corn, and I watched it die in a drought. Uh, I grew up in an environment that was immersed in weather and the importance of weather. But I never put weather and the Civil War together until I started writing the Perryville book. And after that, discussions of drought and heavy rain and flooding started to infiltrate my lectures, to the point that I started telling my students, somebody needs to write a good book about Civil War weather. And I said that for years. No one did. So one morning at breakfast, I rather cockily decided maybe I could do it myself. Now, this is not to say that Civil War historians have ignored weather. Far from it. And I've given you some examples here on the PowerPoint that will give you a sense of what I mean. Historians of the soldier experience, going all the way back to Bell Wiley, write about how soldiers dealt with weather, the shelter they built, the things they wore, their ponchos. Historians of battles and campaigns, to an extent, deal with the weather context of those events. We think about Civil War weather in popular culture. Movie Glory, I think the most poignant scene in Glory is the one that just has Morgan Freeman silently doing guard duty, walking his beat in a driving rainstorm somewhere outside of Boston. I've included a photo of my friend Daryl Black, one of the pioneering Civil War living historians in the country, now the director of the Seminary Ridge Museum in Gettysburg. And I remember asking Daryl, when you're out doing living history, what's the question that people ask you the most? And he said, people ask, are those wool uniforms hot? Well, they are, of course. Probably the closest thing to an important book, or at least a reference work on Civil War weather, is Bob Crick's Civil War Weather in Virginia, which I think is a magnificent book if you're doing any sort of research on the Virginia theater. It should be by your side, but it's really not an analytical work. It's a reference work. It gives you day-by-day information about the weather, taken largely from the observations of one man, a minister in Georgetown, who was part of a much larger system. There's a photo of the Smithsonian Institution there at the bottom. In the 1840s, the Smithsonian began a national program of trying to collect weather data from around the country. They would send local observers all the instruments and forms they needed in order to make observations 3 times a day, at 7 a.m., 2 p.m., and 9 p.m. The theory was that weather was not isolated, that weather in Alabama might eventually affect weather in Virginia or Illinois. They were well ahead of our knowledge of cold fronts and warm fronts and the like. And so they were compiling information in an effort to see really what made weather work. This system largely fell apart in the Confederacy during the war, although there were some rather amazing people who kept making weather observations nonetheless. It certainly survived in the North, which is why a professor in Gettysburg was out taking his readings at 7 a.m. and 2 p.m. and 9 p.m. on July 1st, 1863, as the Confederate Army swept by his house. And there he was out there taking weather observations. These weather observers were a tenacious group of people. And they've given us a lot of raw material that, to be perfectly honest, most Civil War historians, with the exception of a few like Bob Crick, have ignored. A few years before I was born, in the early 1950s, the great Civil War historian Douglas Southall Freeman in the last few weeks of his life, begged Civil War buffs to start compiling, finding weather information because he recognized that we lacked that context for the history that we were writing. And yet it didn't happen. It didn't happen for many years. What I'm suggesting to you here is that, yes, Civil War historians have studied weather in all sorts of ways. But what we've done is look at individual examples. And what I wanted to do in the Howling Storm was connect all those dots, connect all those soldier accounts, connect those civilian accounts, those farm accounts, those Smithsonian accounts and hard weather data that came from the military, to connect those dots and try to get a sense of what Civil War weather was like. And I think more importantly, was it important? Was it important? I have a retired colleague here at Auburn who used to terrify graduate students during doctoral exams. At a certain point, he'd always look at the student who had just described this important topic, and at least important to the student. My friend Bill would say, so what? Why is this important? And you're perfectly welcome to be asking me that question right now. Why is Civil War weather important? Let me try to explain, at least in an introductory manner. I think we have a tendency to believe that Civil War weather was quote unquote normal, that it was mere background scenery, and surely it was weather like any other weather that we would experience in a given year. And that's simply not true. To use the technical term, Civil War weather was weird. It was strange. It was unusual. People at the time understood that they were going through an unusual period of weather. This began even before the war. As Western historians and meteorologists know, in the 20 years leading up to Appomattox, there was a massive drought across the entire western half of the United States. This had major implications for the westward movement, for the decline of certain Native American groups, notably the Comanche. Drought was devastating to economies based on horses that fed off the land. Later, as we approach the last few years before the Civil War, we enter a period that meteorologists call the Great Civil War Drought in the West. And that fascinates me too, because meteorologists talk about the Great Civil War Drought. Until a couple of years ago, I had never met a Civil War historian who had ever heard of the Great Civil War Drought. So there's this interesting period happening in the American West. The summer and fall of 1861, as the war began, as those rookie soldiers went to war, was extremely hot, more than usual it seemed, to the point that soldiers were falling out and dying along the line of march all over the battlefront. Notably, I'm thinking about the Union Army as it approached Wilson's Creek in Missouri. It was a very, very hot summer, an unusually hot summer. Early December 1861, people in Virginia were writing about how they had never seen such a warm, lush December. Flowers were blooming in Virginia in the first part of December. And then the weather turned very cold, snowy, icy at the end of the year, confounding all sorts of winter operations, like Stonewall Jackson's Bath Romney campaign, which really almost came to disaster in the snow. Colder weather and wet weather continued well into the spring. Unusually cold and wet weather. Farmers noticed this. Farmers found themselves getting their crops into the fields a month later than usual. And they were already worried about what would happen at harvest time, never knowing that once they got through this incredibly wet period, drought would follow. Through the summer, into the fall, in some cases, say in Middle Tennessee, into November and December of 1862, a massive American drought that was devastating the crops, especially in the Confederacy. And what's remarkable about this pattern is that it happened again in 1863 and in 1864, except in 1864, the drought shifted to the north, still in Missouri, still in Virginia, but now into the American Midwest and into New England. I was once taught that one of the great triumphs of the North during the war was the fact that it was able to increase food production throughout the war, despite the fact that all of those soldiers were in the field. And that's simply not true. The best year for agriculture in the North was 1862. Drought played a major role in reducing crops in 63 and 64, but so did other unseasonable weather. Early frosts coming down from Canada through the Midwest, eventually into the upper South, destroyed crops in the field in August of 1863 and again late in September of 1863. This was the same cold front that brought that chilly weather to Chickamauga Creek the night before the battle began after a long season of heat and dust. All of these weather events were unusual. And I think they really are important. If you want to ask, so what? Here's the answer to a so what question. When I was in grad school many years ago, we were taught that there were two basic explanations for Confederate defeat. There was the externalist explanation. Confederates lost the war on the battlefield. But there was also an internalist explanation that focused on dissension at home, class conflict, gender conflict, certainly the Confederacy's inability to win the support of African Americans. We talked about things like the tax in kind and the impressment law, legislation that came out of Richmond that pushed away many common folks into apathy, if not unionism. And we've had that discussion really in some ways since 1865. We've had it in earnest throughout my career, and with a couple of exceptions. Paul Gates, over 50 years ago, the late Armistead Robinson. Aside from them, we've had this debate without anyone even knowing, it seems, that the Confederate experiment took place in the midst of these droughts, that there really were food shortages, there really was hunger in some area, and that the Richmond government really did have to make hard decisions about whom do we feed, soldiers or civilians. We've had this internalist discussion without the basic foundation being there. And the foundation is weather, it's drought, and late planting, and too much rain, and all those factors that contributed to a lack of food in the Confederacy. Why? Why has this happened? If I had more time, I could go into some detail, but let me just indicate why Civil War weather seems to have been so unusual. Most of you will recognize the notion of an El Nino. Normally we hear about El Nino in connection with flooding or fire in California, but there's certainly more to it than that. El Nino is part of a wider worldwide weather phenomenon called the El Nino Southern Oscillation, or ENSO, which is shaped by water temperature and wind currents in the Pacific, essentially between Indonesia and Peru. There is no widespread agreement about how ENSO affected the Civil War years because we just don't have the data. They didn't have Doppler radar. They didn't have the sophisticated weather tools that people have today. But there's general agreement that at least in the first year of the war, there was a mild La Nina. La Nina is often described as extreme normal. In a La Nina year, the South tends to be hot and dry, whereas winter in the Northeast tends to be pretty cold. After that, there's even less agreement. There are some scholars who will argue that La Nina extended into the rest of the war. There are other scholars, I'm thinking of Richard Grove and George Adamson, who argue that, in fact, it was the El Nino phenomenon that became active in 1862 and 1864, and then again early in Reconstruction. El Nino, which would have made for a wetter southern winter, a colder southern winter. Which is it? The jury's still out. But we can certainly believe that El Nino was active during the Civil War years. And perhaps just as importantly, not by itself. Uh, our weather folks on TV will often talk about El Nino, but they usually don't say much about the North Atlantic Oscillation, NAO. This is a similar occurrence in the Atlantic, which runs from a permanent low pressure system around Iceland to a permanent high pressure system around the Azores. But those barometric pressures rise and fall for reasons that no one really understands. And in some years, the difference between those two poles is much greater than usual. And in some years, the difference between those poles is much less than usual. That's usually called a negative NAO. A negative NAO will bring cold and snowy weather to the American Southeast and the Northeast, as well as Western Europe. And the data certainly suggests that there was a negative NAO in 1862, 1864, and again 1865, which would help explain all of that cold, heavy snow in those winters. If you put ENSO and the North Atlantic Oscillation together, what you have is a recipe for very odd, volatile weather. And that seems to be what happened in the Civil War years. It affected crops, it affected civilians, it affected soldiers. And in truth, the Howling Storm, more than anything else, is a military history. A few years ago, I wrote a book chapter about this topic, and I suggested that perhaps a half of campaigns and battles, maybe more than half, were significantly affected by weather conditions. I've revised that in the book. I think in some ways, every battle and campaign was affected by weather, and not just bad weather or dramatic weather. We can certainly talk about the cold and the ice at Fort Sanders in Knoxville. We can talk about the heavy rains after the Battle of Gettysburg, as depicted in the Edwin Forbes painting at the top. We can talk about the horrible rain at Jenkins Ferry, as depicted in the film Lincoln. But what we sometimes forget is that good weather is just as important to armies as bad weather. Many years ago, the weather historian David Ludlam pointed out that as William Tecumseh Sherman took his army across Georgia, he was blessed with what Ludlam called Yankee weather. And in his official reports from Savannah, Sherman said much the same thing. How great the weather had been, how it had been perfect for what he was trying to accomplish. Heavy rain in Georgia, flooded rivers. The march to the sea could have turned out very differently, but it didn't. And so what was good weather for Sherman was bad weather for the Confederates, but just as significant as a snowstorm or heat. And what I try to do in the book, as I said in the introduction, going from Fort Sumter to Appomattox and beyond, is not only to point out how weather affected campaigns and battles, but how it altered possible outcomes in some ways, why it was important. A book that has really influenced me over the years is a book by the historian Mike Davis, and it's called Late Victorian Holocausts. Davis's subject is imperialism. How European powers, plus the United States and Japan, were able to take over, occupy so much of the world in the late 19th century, carving up Africa, carving up much of Asia. Usually when we talk about those topics in class, we talk about steamships, telegraphs, machine guns, ideas of nationalism and jingoism. But what we normally didn't talk about in those lectures was weather. But in fact, as Mike Davis pointed out, between 1877 and 1902, 3 strong El Nino periods brought monsoon and drought to parts of the world that created such famine that between 30 and 50 million people died because of the weather and government's inability to deal with that unexpected weather. And he calls that the secret history of the 19th century. What I hope I've done with the Howling Storm is write a secret history of the Civil War by likewise putting it back into that context of weather and climate. As I researched this book and as I put it together, I was amazed by what I was finding. And I can tell you with all honesty that I don't look at the Civil War the way I used to. I don't look at the generals the way I used to. I don't look at the presidents the way I used to. I understand this conflict differently. And my hope is that you will too, once you take a look at this book. So that's my brief account of what I try to do in the Howling Storm. I am now available until 3 o'clock Central. So please type in your questions. And as they come to me, I will try to answer as many of them as possible. So wonderful. Here they come. You don't have to stare at me staring at the screen anymore. Laura asks, other than the writings of the participants of the conflict, what resources for weather information did you have? Well, first of all, I should mention that I used the writings of 470 participants, soldiers and civilians. But I also used government reports. Obviously, I used the official records. And I used any hard data weather information that I could find. The Smithsonian reports sometimes were exactly what I needed. It's really pretty easy to get a sense of what the temperatures were, the barometric pressures were in the east. Sometimes it's more difficult in the Western theater, though not impossible. It gets even tougher in the Trans-Mississippi, unfortunately. But I used that hard data whenever I could, not only from the Smithsonian program, but from the Army and the Navy. The US Navy was supposed to keep daily weather records in their logs. The ocean-going Navy was very good at that. The riverine Navy, not so much. So there are moments when I'm approximating more than I would like. But yes, what I really wanted to do was not just use those soldier accounts, but to try to see what was actually happening. And so for battles like Gettysburg or the Middle Tennessee campaigns, or certainly in Virginia, you can really get a handle on what the temperatures were that day. So that's the kind of information that I used. Did Civil War soldiers have to contend with hurricanes? There weren't many, actually, Jenny. There weren't many, but there were a few, and they were significant. There was a hurricane that came ashore in, I believe, September of 1861 that affected notably R.A. Lee's Chief Mountain Campaign in West Virginia, created all sorts of flooding. It also flooded Washington. There was another hurricane in 1861 that for several days delayed a Union expedition to capture the Sea Islands of South Carolina and North Carolina. There's a hurricane later in the war that my good friend Kerry Mock and his colleague Mike Chenoweth just discovered a few years ago. There were no actual newspaper accounts or other kinds of accounts of this hurricane, and yet the records are clearly there when you start looking at ship logs in particular. They've named this Hurricane Amanda for a US Navy ship that sank near Apalachicola. So those are the only hurricanes, really. And it's another suggestion that larger weather systems were afoot, that there were so few in that period, and that they never made it into, Hurricane Amanda at least never made it into the newspapers. I should have mentioned when I was talking about sources, I used a lot of newspapers. Um, we're lucky these days. We have keyword searching and indexes online. And I think I was able to amass a remarkable amount of data from especially northern newspapers, but also from southern newspapers as they delineated the various droughts. LB wants to know, when you say that weather worked in the Union's favor, was this purely luck, or was the Union Army somehow better equipped to weather storms? Yes, they were. I mean, it was luck sometimes. I was thinking about this morning. Confederate armies led by Sterling Price, they were just unlucky when it came to weather. It seemed like every time bad weather hit in Missouri, they were out in the field and their opponents were under shelter. So sometimes, yes, it was luck. But beyond that, the Union Army was better prepared to deal with it. Although they weren't issued by the Army at first, soldiers had to buy them individually. Union soldiers had rubber ponchos. Confederates did not have rubber ponchos unless they could capture them after a battle. The best they could do was cloth painted with linseed oil. The Union Army had a better supply system. Sometimes it broke down, as when Sherman went through South Carolina. But by and large, they were better equipped. They had better uniforms. They had coats. They were in a position to recover much better than the Confederates. That's not to say that they had it great. They didn't. But this is one of those moments where northern industry really was important because it's producing tents and shoes and rain gear that the Confederates could only dream about and hope to capture, and sometimes stop their pursuits and stop fighting simply because they saw some of these things and wanted to grab them. Janie gives me a compliment. That's very interesting. I've never considered the impact weather could have on a war or battle. Gives a new context. I certainly hope it does. I certainly hope it does. There are a lot of battles that would have turned out differently had conditions been different. And I'm not one of those what if historians. I tend not to get into speculative history, but it's hard not to think about. For example, when Jubal Early took his little army into Maryland toward Washington in 1864, it was incredibly hot. The weather was hitting the 100-degree mark, and there was dust on the road, and he lost a lot of men on the way. And it slowed down his march by a day. He could have gotten to Washington a day earlier. And so when he arrived in Washington, his men were lining up outside of a very important fort on the north side of Washington at almost the exact moment that Union troops were arriving from Virginia. 24 hours could have made a difference. Not that Early could have held Washington forever, but even running around the streets of Washington for a few hours would have embarrassed the Lincoln administration in an election year. So there are all sorts of moments like that where I think weather really changes the direction of the conflict. Greg says, Ken, glad to see this work come out. This was a point of interest in your classes and work from the first time I met you. And it's true. I've been thinking about weather in the Civil War, as I said, since I did the Perryville book. Was there anything interesting you found in your research that didn't end up in the book? Yeah, and I should tell a story on myself, Jenny. Well, I'll just do this. It's a big book. It's a big book. With index, it is 670 pages. The original manuscript was a lot larger still. There was a point where I was really thinking about this as a 2-volume work. And so things had to be cut. But already there were things that I wanted to write about, but I just didn't see that I had the space. So, for example, well, I'll give you a few examples that I hope will encourage other scholars to pursue these topics. In terms of military history itself, there's not much in here about the coastal war. Those soldiers in forts north and south who often were dealing with harsh weather more than they were dealing with the enemy. I would have liked to have included more of that. I have some information. I just didn't have space for it. There's not much in here about the Navy or the Naval War, although surely they were affected by weather as well. I spent part of my career writing about guerrilla warfare. I'm known in some circles for writing about guerrilla warfare, but that's not here. I would have liked to have included a lot more about the guerrillas and how they were affected by insurgency. I could have said more about the home front, I think. I had some information that I could have used. And one thing that I didn't have a lot of research on, but I wished I had, and that I hope that others will pursue and find. I would love to know more about the relationship between this weather context that I'm talking about and emancipation, about people fleeing slavery, fleeing into those refugee camps where so many of them died of disease. I'm thinking about my friend Amy Taylor's work on Camp Nelson, Kentucky, where a cold snap killed all sorts of family members of African-American Union soldiers, and how the deaths of those people actually changed federal policy. Those are all things that I hope somebody pursues. And I had information for some of that. But when your editor tells you you need to cut 300 pages, trust me, you cut 300 pages. Steve asked, did you have to reevaluate any general's conduct during the war once you fully accounted for the weather's role in the battle or campaign? Funny you ask, Steve, because I was part of a conversation on Facebook just last night about this very topic. There are certainly generals that I'm more sympathetic to. It doesn't mean I'm going to join their fan club and buy t-shirts, but I've become more sympathetic to some of these characters, understanding what they faced in terms of mud, especially that red clay Altasol mud, which runs across most of the American South, which, as they said in 1861 or 1862, was bottomless. Bottomless. You would just keep sinking. You couldn't find a firm level from which to dig out. That's what Union armies were facing. That's what George B. McClellan faced on the peninsula as he moved up the peninsula in 1862. It was easy at the time for the Lincoln administration to criticize him for not taking Richmond. It has been awfully darn easy for Civil War buffs since 1862 to criticize George B. McClellan. There was a lot of it going on in this Facebook conversation last night, but in fact, once you see what McClellan was up to, yes, I'm more sympathetic to him. I'm more sympathetic to George Meade in the pursuit after Gettysburg. In retrospect, Meade made a couple of decisions that were ultimately the wrong ones, but they made sense at the time. He rested his army and then took them south down the better road. And he should have reached the Potomac ahead of Lee, but that rain and all that mud intervened. And actually, one of the things I discovered in the research is that the sort of mud that Meade's army faced on the way to the Potomac was worse than the mud that Lee's army had to deal with over on the other side of the mountains as they approached the Potomac. So I think, again, President Lincoln was being unfair when he criticized Meade for not capturing Lee's army north of the Potomac. So I think those are the two that I've reevaluated the most. U.S. Grant, I won't say I reevaluated. I think my findings confirm what I already knew about Grant, but I'm certainly more interested in him. He's probably the character who appears in the book more than anyone else. And Grant just represented those generals, that mindset that didn't care about the weather. If they needed to get to point B from point A, they went. Although it generally cost him a lot more in terms of men and material and horses and mules. And I should mention, just as an aside, this was a devastating war for horses and mules. I don't think most Americans realize that perhaps 1 million or more horses and mules died in this war. That Southern supplies of horses and mules were devastated for years. Grant forged ahead, but there was a cost. And finally, if we're going to talk about reevaluation, I'll mention somebody who wasn't a general, I'm an Abraham Lincoln fan. I think Abraham Lincoln was our greatest president. I have a huge poster of Abraham Lincoln on my front door at my office on campus. But when it came to understanding logistics or what it took to move armies in bad weather, uh, Lincoln was not the military genius we sometimes pretend that he was. In fact, I think in some ways, at those moments, he became the worst kind of armchair general, expecting his armies to do the impossible because it looked possible on a map. I don't mean to criticize Civil War enthusiasts today. I've done the same thing. You sit around and you read about this campaign or this general and you think, well, why couldn't they have won this battle? Why couldn't they have gotten to Richmond? Um, those thoughts are not always realistic. I wish the president had known better. Again, that's not to defend George McClellan or George Meade excessively, but I certainly changed my minds about them. I tend to be on their side of the argument more than the president's these days, which was certainly an unexpected result. Rand asked, did soldiers or their commanders sometimes interpret strange weather as a sign of divine judgment? Sometimes. But interestingly enough, not as much as I anticipated. Yes, they did. A couple of times in the book, I deal with a colonel from New York who looked at the results of the Peninsula Campaign and wondered if God had turned against the Union. I read a lot of sermons for this, assuming that I would find Southern ministers blaming drought on the people's sins. I thought there would be a lot more talk of providence and God's hand in the weather than I actually found. So while there was certainly some of that, there wasn't a lot. Weather seemed to be more chance or just normal, rather than God punishing us with rain here or snow there. What that says to us about our ideas of this generation, I'm not sure. It might imply more secularization than I think I would have expected, but I didn't find a lot. I surely didn't. And it's interesting too, Southern ministers in 1861, when things were going well, were quick to assign God the glory for bountiful harvests. But once the harvest became less than bountiful, they dropped that topic entirely. They seemed a lot more concerned with defending slavery and criticizing the sins of the Confederate people, like speculation and rampant theater going. I never really knew rampant theater going was that much of a problem in the Civil War, but apparently it was. Any more questions, folks? That's all. Well, thank you so much for joining me today uh, here in Auburn, where it's become even cloudier while we spoke. If you read this book, and if you like this book, if you have questions about this book, please don't hesitate to email me. As I said, my great hope is that it will change the way you look at the Civil War. If it does, I'd like to know. Let me know. But until then, I'm going to sign off. I'm going to wish all of you a great day. I hope to see you at some point along the way once we're past COVID-19. Bye-bye.